All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Austin Holmes. I'm the Community Resource Engagement Specialist for Utah as part of the Mountains and Plains Thriving Communities Collaborative, or MAPTech as we call it, which is the EPA Region 8 Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, or TICTAC. Region 8 includes Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, North Dakota, South Dakota, as well as the 28 federally recognized tribal nations within the region. We're one of 17 TICTACs across the country. Our administration, excuse me, our administrative hub is based in Montana State University, in partnership with Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy, the Center for Environmental Justice at Colorado State University, the Center for Social Creativity, and land grant institutions, including North Dakota University, South Dakota State University, Utah State University, and the University of Wyoming. MAPTech supports local and tribal governments, organizations, and disadvantaged communities in creating sustainable, healthy environments and addressing environmental justice concerns by helping them start, fund, and carry out locally driven projects for environmental and energy justice. And while MAPTech doesn't write grants on behalf of organizations, we can help find grant writing resources and provide one-on-one support for successful grant development. So our goal is to enhance your funding success through a combination of broad knowledge sharing and targeted individualized guidance. So regarding questions today, if you happen to have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end. And it's my pleasure today to welcome our presenter, Stephanie Malin. Stephanie is a professor of sociology at Colorado State University. She studies environmental justice, health, and governance in extractive systems, and communities building distributive and regenerative systems. Stephanie utilizes community-based participatory research methods, works with community partners, and utilizes mixed methods. She's a founding co-director of the Center for Environmental Justice at CSU, where she is an award-winning teacher of courses on environmental justice, water and social justice, environmental sociology, and qualitative methods. She's written 2 books, Building Something Better, Environmental Crises and the Promise of Community Change, and The Price of Nuclear Power, Uranium Communities and Environmental Justice. As a public sociologist, Stephanie's work can be found in outlets like The Conversation and High Country News, as well as top journals like Social Forces and Social Problems. Thanks for being here with us today, Stephanie. I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you so much, Austin, for that introduction, and thank you all for spending some time here today. I appreciate it, and I look forward to answering your questions. I will go ahead and share my screen and get started so that we have plenty of time for your questions. My plan is to talk a little bit about environmental justice basics. Well, all right. And I can't see any of you, so if you need anything, flag me down, even though we're saving Q&A for the end. The teacher in me doesn't like to be able to not see my audience, so let me know if you need anything. So I will start out by talking about environmental justice, the 4 strands of it, what it is, as well as breaking down those strands in terms of distributive, procedural, recognition, and restorative justice. Then I'll talk a little bit about Indigenous environmental justice and critical environmental justice perspectives, give some examples from our region and from my own research, and then talk, if we have a little bit of time, talk a little bit about not only general examples of alternative economic systems that tend to nurture environmental justice a little bit more than our current capitalist neoliberal system that we're embedded in, but that also facilitates some of the deeper aspects of EJ and the critical and Indigenous environmental justice perspectives we'll talk about a little today. So we'll have some examples from the region as well, to kind of facilitate that, and then I look forward to your questions. Austin did a terrific job of giving my background, so I don't feel the need to dig into it too much, other than just to remind you all that I'm at the Center for Environmental Justice at Colorado State, so kind of the south node of our MAPTech program. and I'm one of the founders of MapTech. Just trying to get it off the ground and writing the grants for it and everything. So this is thrilling to me to be one of the webinar participants and to see this in action. It's very exciting. So to get started, before I get into environmental justice, I just want to explain a bit about what environmental sociology is. Most people I encounter don't know what it is. I'm sure you all do, but I just as a little primer or reminder, when environmental sociology was founded as a subfield, well after sociology itself was a formal discipline, like most colonial disciplines, right, sociology was starting to kind of get its footing in the 1800s, mid 1800s, especially in response to the Industrial Revolution and how much society was changing. But one of the key rules there among sociologists was that they only talked about social facts, right? About things that were separate from the quote unquote natural world, because we didn't want to be mistaken for biology or chemistry or physics at the time, right? Really wanted to establish ourselves as our own social science. But of course, by the 1960s and 70s, it became pretty obvious that to be good sociologists, right, to really pay attention to what was going on in the world around us, we really had to pay attention to our social structures, environmental and ecological impacts, right? This, of course, is a time when environmental activism is really taking off, when we are having a very visible impact on the environment and around us. And by we, I mean Western industrial societies in particular, fossil fuel driven systems, right? And so environmental sociology was founded as a subfield around that time in response to all the social action and social movements and the need to really try to understand how our biophysical systems interact with our social systems and vice versa, particularly the way we've organized ourselves economically, right? And the extractive ways that we've organized ourselves in that way. So when we think about central questions that environmental sociologists look at, we are scientists of social systems and structures and institutions, often policies. And like myself, right, as a qualitative or mixed methods researcher, we usually figure those things out in terms of how different people and systems are embedded within those structures. So we take a multi-scalar perspective to answer how social systems interact with the natural world. And I have quotations around some of these words because, of course, human beings and our societies are part of nature. And that's one of the central rifts that environmental sociology tries to understand and heal, this idea that we're somehow separate from or exempt from the rules of the natural world. We look a lot at inequality and power differentials. And one of the questions we ask as environmental sociologists are how resources, so-called resources, right, the goods and the bads are distributed within society. And that means the good things, right, like access to clean air, clean water, affordable public transit or any public transit, green spaces, bike paths, those sorts of things. But then also, how are the bad things, harms, pollutants, hazards, toxicants, right? How are those distributed within society? And as we get into environmental justice a bit more, I'll dig into the inequality there, right? Which again is a central concern of environmental and all sociology, right? Inequality writ large. We're also really concerned with who makes those decisions about how our society is structured, right? The impacts that we have on biophysical systems and how those goods and bads are distributed. And as a sociologist looking at structures and systems, we're really concerned with the institutional context, right? So that can be institutions like physical, like relationships and systems like marriage or family. Gender is an institution, for example, but they're also the social structures that we build to kind of carry on our economic and political and other systems from one generation to the next. So we're very focused on institutions, and I focus a lot on governance, right? So regulations and policies around environmental and extractive behavior. We think about how we heal rifts between nature and human beings and how we build more just, distributive, and regenerative systems. And that's a turn in environmental sociology that I'm especially encouraging. My most recent book with Megan Kallman is encouraging that as well, because while we can critique systems and structures and the problems there, we also need to identify solutions. And there are so many of them visible in the world around us that I'll focus on a little bit today. So, a core observation of environmental sociology is that environmental injustice, environmental problems are fundamentally based in how human society is organized, right? So all the problems that we're going to talk about today in terms of environmental injustice are a result of the way we organize ourselves. And that's really important for us to understand because while we want to understand the problems, that also gives us a key to understanding the solutions, right? We can understand that if a problem is evident, if we identify the driver of it and how it's related to social organization, we can undo that or we can address it and we can build more equitable, just, regenerative systems. So, one of the key findings across environmental sociology is that there are two key social dynamics that systematically create inequality in terms of environmental inequality or injustice. And those are the way our market economy functions. So, inequality that's inherent to capitalist and especially neoliberal systems, and institutionalized racism. So, the ways in which our institutions have furthered racial capitalism. And I'll be referring to neoliberal capitalism throughout. If you want a good breakdown on it, our entire third chapter in that book I've been mentioning is on neoliberal capitalism and is a pretty, I teach it a lot and I like to think it's a pretty accessible um, window into that. But the basics here are that neoliberalism is a form of capitalism, right? It's a variety or a type of capitalism in that it's centered on markets and unending growth. But it has some particular characteristics ideologically and in terms of policy measures that make it unique, right? It's a pretty austere form of capitalism in that it really centers private property and free markets above all everything else, right? So the how well we're doing as people, how well the environment might be doing, nature, our climate, right? Those sorts of things take a back seat to how well the market is doing. And that's why we tend to, in neoliberal and other Western or mainstream economics, we tend to externalize social and environmental costs of the market system. It also is very focused on deregulation and re-regulation, so getting rid of social protections or rules, especially around environment and labor. Stripping social safety nets, right? Making it so that the state doesn't really provide social safety nets like access to healthcare or affordable housing or childcare that's affordable, or you kind of name it in terms of thinking about what makes us stable and less vulnerable in a social system, and that's what neoliberalism is meaning to strip away. There's also a strong focus on financialization and globalization of market systems. And privatization is a key component of neoliberalism. So, privatizing public or communal or what we might call quote unquote natural resources and making them for sale in marketplaces and not, and kind of taking them away from millennia of communal management. So, that gives us a little bit of a breakdown when I talk about it. What does that mean? One reminder, right? When we're doing good environmental justice work, we are best served by thinking intersectionally. And so this is one of the most comprehensive and kind of most accessible graphics I've seen of intersectionality, looking at what it means to try to think about individuals' locations within a complex matrix of social variables, right? We think a lot about race and ethnicity, class or socioeconomic status, gender, but we also want to think about age, education, mental health, various abilities, language, and many other social variables. And in the context of our region, a really important one that I tend to look at a lot is where do we live geographically? So are we living in a more rural space? Are we living in a space that might have a history of being natural resource dependent, for example, in our local economies, and therefore maybe more tied to global commodity markets that are unstable? Or do we live in more urban areas? Do we live in peri-urban areas, right? So our location also really matters here. And I'm just planting the seed so we can appreciate how important it is to think about a variety of drivers and variables in terms of what creates the environmental injustices that I'll talk about today. So, from a social science perspective, what do we know about environmental justice? Well, we know a lot, right? We have, and many of you appreciate this, I'm sure, right? That we have now thousands of studies, both in environmental sociology, sociology more broadly, public health, environmental epidemiology, urban planning, anthropology, political science, geography, you name it. This is a cross-disciplinary area of research. And we have hundreds of studies that have now become thousands of studies when we look globally and across disciplines that show a very specific pattern to environmental inequality, both within the US, which is where a lot of this research started, and globally. So we see these patterns produced within nations like the US, but also between nations, right, as we take a more global perspective. So we know that today, from all this empirical evidence, right, that in general, ethnic minorities, Indigenous persons and Native nations, people of color, and low-income communities confront a higher burden of environmental exposure from a variety of sources. And these include air and water and soil pollution. And so we see some ways in which certain social variables, particularly race, ethnicity, class, but also remember all those other variables are factoring in important ways. Those are the groups that are more exposed to those environmental bads, right? And those environmental bads typically emerge from industrial processes, militarization, and that's had a particularly pernicious effect since World War II and following. When we think about, for example, the modern US military is the number one polluter in the world. And then from consumer practices, right? And what that means is not that we're going to change the world by voting with our dollar, but that we have mass consumption being encouraged by various policies at national and global levels since the end of World War II, just to keep that kind of war economy going and as strong as possible. This also includes things like packaging and the use of plastics and things like that within that context. So, in other words, right, we have mountains of evidence that environmental inequality exists. We have identified the drivers of it, we've identified the sources of it, and the mechanisms behind those sources, right? So, we know who's affected, we know why they're affected, and we know what affects them in very well established ways. So now I'll move a little bit to defining environmental justice, right? What is it? What are different dimensions to it? And why do those matter for the work that we're doing or for the community kind of facilitation and advocacy that we might be doing in our different locations around Region 8? Environmental justice is really important in terms of understanding it as addressing people's and communities' unequal experiences of environmental harms, right? So those sources of pollution that I was just talking about, for example, are contaminants, toxicants in the environment, and those benefits, meaning when we typically look at those results I was just talking about, right, those mountains of evidence, the flip side of that is that often those same disproportionately impacted communities are the ones who also have inequitable access to all those good things like clean air, clean water, green spaces, transportation to get around affordably. And that really matters because we see that pattern again repeated across the US over time, but repeated other places as well. One of the goals of environmental justice, right, so focusing on solutions, is to amplify the power of communities and affected parties and more than humans, which we'll get into in critical environmental justice, to participate in making decisions. And that means participate in an authentic, meaningful way, right? Not just have a seat around the table or make in a comment for 3 minutes at a public meeting, but actually talk about and help form what decisions are being made and the core kind of contexts of those decisions. We also need access to useful translated information, and I'll get more into that as I talk about procedural justice in particular. We want to recognize that the most minoritized groups in our societies have to be included as meaningful participants. And often those are the folks that are most exposed and to distributive injustice and quite frequently have the least experience of procedural injustice, right? So are the least recognized and the least included in terms of having a seat at the table. The goal here, beyond this too, in terms of restorative justice, is also to restore right relationships to land, to water, with more than humans, to again heal that rift and see ourselves as part of the world around us, right? And as land, water, and more than humans as living, breathing beings, right? That should have some perhaps rights within the system. And again, I'll talk about all of these as I dig into the different strands of EJ more. One really important thing to realize too about the research or academic side of this is that the research around environmental justice and injustice really developed it was kind of co-created with activism, right? So a lot of the research that started in the US in the 80s and a little earlier and really took off by the 1990s and 2000s was following and observing the environmental justice movement that also took off around that time, right? For those of us who've heard of Love Canal or the landfill protests in Warren County, North Carolina, for example, that kind of jump started the public imagination in terms of environmental injustice. And researchers, including state researchers, but also university researchers, really wanted to pay attention to what was going on. It also involves advocacy research, where we can be, and we are, I would define myself as an advocacy researcher. We're incredibly rigorous, right, and very objective, quote unquote, in the and I just say quote unquote because we're human beings, right? So we can be as objective as possible. But we have to realize that even with rigorous research and objective findings, given the gravity of what we study, it's somewhat irresponsible to be neutral about it, right? For example, study a lot of children's health impacts around spaces that have been that have oil refineries, oil production, uranium production going on within them. And once we find out that children are being impacted inequitably, it's necessary, right, to advocate for the policy implications that come along with that. Pardon me. So to break this down, and I'll dig into each one of these. Pardon me, I have a little bit of a cough. I apologize. We want to look at different conceptions of environmental justice, and these are distributive, procedural, recognition justice, restorative justice, and then understanding that it's kind of under the umbrella and linked to social justice and having an advocacy-centered approach. So just to briefly give a little bit more detail on these threads that I've been talking about, distributive justice is kind of what we think about when we think about environmental injustice or environmental inequality. It's the strand that all of us are familiar with and know about. And it means that pollution, noxious facilities, things like oil and gas refining, which is pictured here in storage, right? These are distributed unequally in societies. These affect mostly poor, racially minoritized populations first and worst. We also see this with climate injustice, right? The folks who are least responsible for these problems are often the ones that are worst and first affected. Minoritized communities have less access to the good stuff too, like I've talked about, right? So this is all capturing the idea that the way we distribute these things in society is uneven, and it tends to affect the populations and the people with the least power and the least representation. Procedural injustice links to that decision-making and information context. So this is all about decision-making processes that either exclude or include people. So if we realize procedural justice, we're going for decision-making spaces and processes that authentically include everyone affected by a given decision, especially the most impacted. And it's not just the most impacted people, it's most impacted in general. We'll get into that with recognition justice a little bit. And it includes intergenerational justice, right? So paying attention to future generations, as well as multiple generations that are here now in terms of the impacts. Again, being concerned that it's often children and elderly populations that are most susceptible to the health effects of environmental contaminants, for example. Information here is also key. So we want accessible, translated, useful information to be available to everyone who might have to make a decision or participate in those processes. If you don't know what you're thinking about or making decisions about, it's very difficult to be informed and to have a stance. Accessible means we need information translated into all relevant languages, and we need that information to be useful to non-specialists, right? Useful in terms of you don't need a degree in toxicology or sociology or environmental epidemiology to understand what it means when you're reading this information. And it's not enough to have thousands or hundreds of pages of information available online, for example, because not everyone has online access, but also because who has time to wade through all that? So accessibility is really key here. And this information access and access to spaces that allow authentic participation are what precede, support, and help assure distributive justice. So creating systems where there is more equitable distribution of harms and benefits, or maybe we're creating systems that don't necessarily create all of the pernicious harms that we see in industrial capitalist systems. Recognition justice is really closely tied to this, right? And this is a quotation here from Kyle White, who's a scholar in Indigenous environmental justice and especially focuses on the exclusion of various populations from having seats at those tables for a very long time and still, right? There's still, for example, of course, with our tribal communities, as many of you know, right, the debate over consultation versus actually tribal communities being the first and original stewards of these spaces that we inhabit in a settler colony. And perhaps those folks needing to be the ones who actually construct the table and invite people to it. At its bare minimum, though, recognition justice requires that policies and programs have to meet the standard of fairly considering and representing the cultures, the values, and the situations of all affected parties. And this is really affected to ideas of environmental heritage, relationships that societies and people and cultures have to lands. And we want to think about rights of nature within this context as well. And this is where thinking about recognizing more than humans, land, water as entities that are living with rights, right? That also need to have a seat at the table. This is the thread of EJ where that really comes alive. Restorative justice originated in criminal justice, and it's all about restoring relationships. Here in an environmental justice context, it's about how to build new social, economic, and intersectional approaches that counter the injustices we found and that build more equitable and sustainable systems. So this is where we try to talk about building relationships, right relationships with land and water, acknowledging that people are indeed a part of nature, that we are dependent upon it, and that there's no exemption, right, from human societies to natural systems. And this also involves land remediation and water remediation, healing the spaces that have been polluted by industrial systems. I want to link here to a bit to environmental justice and health. This tends to be what I specialize in, given that in my community-based work, often, like I said before, health impacts or symptoms are some of the first signs that there is an environmental injustice issue and that people are being exposed to contamination. And this is especially emergent in children, right? Children's health is especially vulnerable to pollutants and toxicants for a variety of reasons. There's some excellent research out there that I'd be happy to share if folks have questions on that. But one of the main reasons, right, is that children's metabolisms move much more quickly. And so they are experiencing impacts from food contamination or water contamination, air pollution, much more quickly than an adult, for example. What we've seen, though, is that there are often strong disparities between folks' daily health experiences, and this can be activists living in the community or any community member, right? Where they observe health impacts that they relate to contamination. So, great examples of this are things like increased rates of breast cancer that have strong empirical links to endocrine disruptors like pesticides in our environment, or the presence of chronic asthma, especially among children who might live near a refinery, right? Or other sources of air pollution like bus depots. But this resistance in the medical profession and in the state and corporations, right, to recognize causal links between those exposures to contaminants and health outcomes. So often those illness claims are contested or denied, and communities end up having the burden of proof put on them. But their innovations in terms of citizen science have been really inspiring, right? Including popular epidemiology or using mapping and other epidemiological tools to locate the origin or the causes of reproductive issues, cancer clusters, asthma clusters, right? Things like that. So health is a very important component of environmental justice and injustice, and a very important signal that there's something going on in the environment around us. So I want to give us a little bit of a breakdown on critical and Indigenous environmental justice perspectives. Critical environmental justice, and David Pello is a premier scholar in environmental justice who kind of came up with these different pillars of how we actually look at systemic drivers of environmental justice and be a bit more critical in terms of the intersecting of multiple inequalities and axes of oppression that drive environmental inequality. His second pillar has to do with paying attention to multiple scales. So there are multiple spatial and time scales in terms of environmental injustices, but also solutions. Provocatively, he really questions the role of the state. And we'll talk about this a bit more in the context of Indigenous environmental justice. But the state has a variety of connotations to it, right? Depending on what populations and groups we're talking about and the level of the state that we're talking about. So sometimes when we take the CEJ or critical environmental justice perspective, we are thinking about how state power can sometimes reinforce or reproduce deep inequalities that lead to the environmental injustices that we're talking about today. And we also need to recognize that though they're treated as dispensable, the very people most affected by environmental injustice and the more than humans most affected are indeed indispensable to these systems. And this is one of the driving needs to have this critical view and also the procedural justice orientation that I've been talking about. I'm not going to do this the justice that I should. I teach an environmental justice course at the graduate level, and we spend quite a long time talking about critical and Indigenous EJ because it's so important, but I do want to bring it into the conversation, especially given that we have so many tribal partners within MapTech and such important need to understand this context. A lot of people will talk about the EJ movement starting in the 70s or 80s, right? But we need to understand that environmental injustice starts with the start of colonialism. And this could be located 500 years or more in the past, right? Some people would even take this back to the start of the spread of Christianity through things like the Crusades, right? So colonialism coupled with capitalism are seen as the major drivers of original injustice that included and really centered on the forced separation of Indigenous peoples and Native nations from their ancestral homelands and from their communities. This includes acknowledging and atoning for centuries of genocidal acts by settler colonies, including the so-called United States, and the intergenerational trauma that is often linked in this context with environmental injustices we might be working around. And this really relates to, again, the histories and the ongoing processes of colonialism and colonization, right? And this really centers on private property as a commodity, right? So the idea of privatizing property, making it a commodity or that can be sold in market-based systems, and the land dispossession and accumulation by dispossession that has gone on around that. And we see then how global inequalities started to form under projects of colonialism and settler colonialism. And this is again why we really need to have that long historical lens. I highly recommend books by Indigenous scholars like Dina Gilio Whitaker and Patty Krawick. I'm finishing an excellent book of hers called Becoming Kin that really, she talks about it as unforgetting the past, right? Remembering what has happened, especially if we live in a settler colony, in order to create relationships and unity and solutions moving forward. Because these environmental injustices are what have become, writ large, environmental deprivations, right? They kind of feed into one another and they have really established some of the global inequalities that drive environmental injustice. We are participating in continued extractivism and continued social dislocation, which is a sense of vulnerability or powerlessness in market-based systems in which we live, right? Very colonial capitalist systems. And so the goal here is to learn these histories to build better systems now and in the future. Indigenous environmental justice teaches that this might mean a political scale beyond the state, right? Thinking about ways that you can build systems that don't always rely on state regulation, for example, and that we need to understand how settler colonialism erases or interferes with systems of responsibility. And Kyle White again talks about this as settler colonialism and environmental injustice at its core, right, being an affront to people's abilities or capacities to experience themselves in the world as responsible for the upkeep of their societies, right? We're very disengaged from reciprocal relationships and the responsibilities that come along with those. In terms of settler colonialism and IEJ, I'll leave us with these thoughts. We have we're seeing the outcome of settler colonialism, which is very much an ongoing project and process and set of policies now, right? This isn't something only in the past. It's a continuation of what we've seen for 500 plus years, where Native and Indigenous peoples have faced multiple and layered inequities. They're dealing with stolen land and violated treaties, forced removal from those lands, and the legacies and ongoing traumas of institutions like boarding schools. We also have seen Native nations relocated to spaces near extractive sites where benefits and profits, if we're talking about extraction like oil and gas or coal or uranium, are then exported away from those spaces. And in general, stark structural violence. And structural violence means the inability of a group of people to actually realize their full potential because things like political and economic structures are created in order to limit those freedoms and the kind of potential that people might have in those spaces in a very structural way. So we address environmental justice and we become and embody environmental justice in our institutions by encouraging and funding democratic science, by employing the precautionary principle, which means that industries or corporations that are extracting, for example, have to show that the burden of proof is on them, essentially, right? To show that their products, their services, their actions are not going to cause problems from cradle to grave, as opposed to what we see typically in the US, which is more of a reactionary principle, as I call it. We had this horrible contamination, or we're dealing with climate crisis or air pollution, for example, because we just react to it, right? Because there hasn't been that sort of precaution built into our regulatory systems. And of course, this creates or requires systemic and policy changes. I want to just call out, right? I've been talking a lot about extractivism, but I want to define this, right? And then kind of explain what this means, because it's a process, right, of extracting from the world around us and seeing the world as and Mother Earth as a system that we can a machine, right, that we can constantly just pull things from. But it's also an ideology, right, about how humanity interacts with and has a relationship with ecological systems. It's very much power over rather than power with. And it's one of the major ideologies that leads to the sorts of with systems of withdrawal and extraction that we see to facilitate global production and market systems. So I want to give us quickly a couple examples here. I'm going to take about 6 more minutes, 7 more minutes, and then I'm happy to open it up to questions. I have done a lot of work on uranium production and injustice. This is, of course, an area that touches a lot of folks in our region, and it really relates to not only energy production, which is a key component of our MAPTAC program, but it also relates to weapons production still. And of course, as many of you know, right, we are living in an era where many of the communities we might work with or serve, not only in Utah and Colorado, but also in Wyoming and the Dakotas, other spaces as well, are dealing with the legacies of uranium production, including health impacts and continued contamination, abandoned mines that haven't been cleaned up, but also the health problems that relate to this, as well as the strong prospect of renewing uranium production. And so there's so much good work on there, especially out there, especially on the impacts to the Diné Nation, in particular the Hopi Nation, some of the Pueblo communities that are just south of our region in New Mexico. And I do a lot of work on some of the interesting and important ways in which some of these communities, not those communities necessarily, but some of them in the Four Corners region actually surprisingly support uranium renewal, and some of the reasons for that. Of course, like I mentioned, right, we have really omnipresent or still present legacies around uranium in Region 8, including economic unevenness and booms and busts that come with it, environmental contamination that's ongoing, and negative health impacts that still emerge in relationship to this. Most of those problems, of course, concentrating in Native nations and poorer communities. There's been a lot of activism around this. For example, I worked in Monticello, Utah quite a bit, where for 30 years now, since 1993, there has been a very strong activist response to uranium's legacy, with the goals being recognition that a problem exists, right? They've done mapping, which you can see an example of on the left, to establish cancer clusters and other disease clusters that are present in this community of 1,900 people. There have been about 600 cases of cancer that have been identified in various households and through these mapping efforts. And so they also want federal health support and the ability to go for cancer screening and treatment locally. Right now, folks living in places like Monticello have to go hundreds of miles to get any of those health services. And like I said, they've been working on this for 30 years, and it's had various ebbs and flows of success and temporary appropriations. But often, this is a great example, right, and kind of an emblem of just how invisible and minoritized these spaces have become in terms of state treatment. We also, now that private industry has gotten more involved, right, see a lot of class antagonism going on. Energy Fuels Resources is one of the major, if not the major player in the US in terms of private uranium production. And they have really, part of the reason why you see support for uranium production and renewal in some spaces is because corporations have played a really important role in terms of coming in and antagonizing class divisions that folks might feel across regions or within communities. This is an example quotation from my book and the field work I was doing, right, where at public meetings, folks who were representing Energy Fuels would stoke those tensions by drawing on the fact that a lot of folks living in communities like Nucla and Natarita, Colorado, had to go work in Telluride, 60 miles away, do a dangerous wintertime commute to have jobs, right? And that if they had a uranium mill closer to their homes, they might be able to work there more fruitfully. Their kids might want to stay in town and live there. So very important things to realize about the way that class plays into this. We also want to understand that this is very much why uranium is framed as having current potential, right? And this has to do with a lot of ongoing activities around not only energy production, but weapons production as well. I'm happy to answer more about this in the Q&A, as well as White Mesa Mill, which is the only operational uranium mill in the US, which is in our region, right? Second example I'm happy to talk about more in Q&A, and I just want to touch on here, is unconventional drilling. This is the use of vertical and horizontal oil and gas drilling, not only in Colorado, this is where I draw the research from because I do a lot of research on that here, but also in Wyoming, in Montana, in many of the spaces within Region 8, right? Where, and this map here just shows us the density of drilling that can go on in very close proximity to highly populated areas. It also goes on a lot in rural spaces as well. And there are important ways in which people's lack of ability to participate meaningfully, right? So the procedural inequity that we see, the fact that local communities cannot always decide whether, when, and where drilling takes place, right? And often don't benefit from it in any sort of way, economically or otherwise, can create chronic negative mental health impacts like stress and depression. And these are things we want to understand as we're going into some of these spaces, or for those of us who work within these spaces, right? What we might want to think of in terms of environmental injustice and what kind of drives it. We were especially, it's especially important that we found that institutional and structural systems, the ways they regulate unconventional oil and gas or UOG production, really matter, right? So our personal or individual level experiences of things like diminished quality of life or chronic stress, these can really relate to uncertainty that we might feel about what the impacts of these industries are, because they can speed ahead with production before regulations are even in place, right? And also because people feel powerless to participate in making decisions around, like I said, where, when, and whether these sorts of extractive activities take place, sometimes 500 or 1,000 feet from people's homes. I want to leave us with, for a couple minutes, just some hope here, right? And some ideas of, we can critique and we can look at environmental inequality, but how do we build new systems to build environmental justice? And there are literally hundreds or thousands of ways we can organize ourselves, organize our societies in a different way. But I want to call out a really provocative one because it's so malleable and it's being used at multiple scales. There's a lot of online communities and physical communities that work around this idea. Amsterdam, for example, is rebuilding much of their economy around this idea of how we get into this just and safe space for humanity, where we can be building regenerative and distributive economic systems that don't have ecological overshoots like we see with climate crisis or land conversion or biodiversity loss, but also provide the good life, right? Really keep intact social foundations like access to basic needs, but also gender equality, social equity, the environmental justice that we're talking about, um, and a sense of safety and political voice where we live. As you'll see, a big part of that social foundation is realizing environmental justice. And so we want to understand that these kinds of alternative economic systems that depart from capitalism tend to not seek endless growth, right? Want to re-embed the economy in social and environmental systems. So recognize that our economy is part of our social system, not separate from it, and part of our ecological system, right? Not able to grow infinitely based on infinite resources. And the key to doing this from this lens is to build distributive, not divisive, and regenerative, not degenerative systems. And I mention this because it can be so inspiring for the kind of work we might be able to do with a MapTac in terms of the kind of funding and projects that we might help facilitate. A little graphic there on re-embedding the economy, and also the fact that the economy has many components, right? It's not just the market, it's also the household, the state, and the commons. Little shout out here if you're interested in that book where we look at some really particular cases in terms of how communities actually do that. How do they build more distributive and regenerative systems? And from our very own region. I just want to leave with some examples that we highlight in our book. We did case studies and interviews with folks in these spaces. Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, which is in South Dakota, is very centered on youth-centered community regeneration, building regenerative agricultural systems, also building regenerative housing structures and systems that are much more based on the ways in which Lakota communities were organized and designed pre-colonization and pre-colonialism. I can talk much more about this in Q&A, or I can also, I'd be happy to send out a copy of our book and talk about, you can read much more in depth what Thunder Valley CDC is doing there. And as many of us know, right, we've got some examples in terms of indigenized energy. That's another case that we look at in our book, but is also doing many wonderful things since our book came out, including being a Solar for All recipient and lead, and centering a lot of their development models beyond economic development, right? In terms of building community-owned solar cooperatives and all of the indirect and direct industries and economic activities that come from that. I will end now for questions, but if you are, I frequently teach environmental justice, and if you're a practitioner, if you're an organizer, if you're a student of this, we can often feel really bogged down by anxiety, by some of the hopelessness we might feel in this context. And so I want to end with, before I take questions, just a tool that I use. I teach a class on climate grief to active hope, or eco grief. I also lead workshops on it for the Center for EJ. And one thing that we center our workshops around is this climate Venn diagram that was created by Ayanna Johnson. She's a marine biologist. And it's all about how to recognize where you might fit. And this could be really useful if you're facilitating organizing within your community, if you are trying to figure this out, right? Asking yourself what brings you joy, what are you good at, and what work needs doing. And it can be in the context of climate justice, but for our purposes, right, could also very much be within the context of environmental justice. So that's a very available online. I'm happy to answer questions about it as well. Now I will really pause for questions. Thank you all for your attention. I'm going to go ahead and escape from this and then stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that
Yeah.
wonderful presentation. So yeah, we have about 10 minutes now for questions. So feel free to either raise your hand or put them in chat.
Sorry, guys. I disappeared for a second there. My
No
internet like
worries.
blipped off. I apologize. I'm
We
back.
we got you back.
So I'm happy to take any questions. I wasn't able to see the chat as we were going, so I don't know if there are any. And I think they
I
would have disappeared for me at this point.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in the chat. Ben, it looks like you've got something.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. That was great, very enlightening. I was wondering if you could talk about your experience as a, community activist working with communities. Like, what are just some of the strategies you've used to kind of connect, like at the community level, with the broader systemic change that you're advocating for? Maybe it's like communication styles, or maybe it's ways of motivating folks, but just maybe some like real tangible strategies for how to connect communities to the larger systemic change.
Yeah, I think one thing that has been really fascinating and important, I think, is that communities are always, and in my experience, very aware of these inequities before I interact with them, right? And so I think just kind of understanding what is known in communities and what parts of the inequities are they most concerned about and most wanting to kind of tackle, given there's usually a particular issue, right? Like a particular refinery or a uranium mine or mill site or a particular set of well paths that we're kind of focusing on, but how to connect that to these broader issues, right? And this is harder to do as when I was a graduate student or an untenured faculty member, but one of the things I've been very excited to be able to do in recent years is actually do deeply based community based work, right? Which the strategy there being community organizations and EJ groups need to be the ones that are actually driving whatever we're doing, right? So you, of course, as a researcher, right, we have to ask questions that are relevant to the literatures in environmental justice or environmental health, and answer questions where there are gaps in that knowledge. But I've been able, especially the last 5 years or so, to really center what communities need, what they want to know, what questions are lingering, and have that be the centerpiece of how we go for funding or what kind of grants we apply for. Um, I see some folks in the audience who may already know about this, right? But for example, I'm co-leading a study around the Suncor oil refinery around Commerce City, Colorado, and Cultivando, a women-led, Latin-led organization in Commerce City, is actually the one who got the grant from the state to study the air pollution and environmental justice impacts of living around that facility. And I worked with them throughout the process, but they were the ones who got the grant and then hired us on to do the work, right? As well as air pollution scientists and others. So really walking the walk, right, in terms of like the communities that we're working with and that you may be from, right, in our audience, you should be in the driver's seat. And that's how we actually make these connections to these bigger systemic inequalities. Because if we shift power dynamics at those smaller scales, they will eventually. I love the work of Adrienne Marie Brown about like emergent strategy, right? Eventually, those smaller scale equities will ripple out to bigger equities in larger systems. So I don't know if that exactly answers your
Yeah.
question, Ben, but that's one of my strategies for sure. And it's not always possible. Sometimes you have to do it at different levels or whatever, or community groups are still forming, right? And don't necessarily have the wherewithal to be the grant recipient and kind of be at the center of all of that. But the more we connect more we build coalitions across Region 8, I think the more groups and organizations at various levels of development can learn that from one another. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was great.
We have about 5 more minutes. If there's any other questions, again, feel free to either raise your hand or just put it in the chat.
I think I've overwhelmed everyone.
Can you
Yes,
please repeat the name of the book?
I probably mentioned too many of them. The one on the different economic systems that I was talking about, and actually I have a copy right here, so I can also show you, is Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. The one that I didn't want to lead with mine, but the one that I was talking about that is my book is called Building Something Better: Environmental Crises and the Promise of Community Change. And I co-authored that with a sociologist, Megan Coleman, but she's also a state senator in Rhode Island. So we focus a lot on very tangible kind of community level, but regional level solutions in terms of how to build distributive and regenerative systems. As a teacher, this was something that I found really lacking in terms of what I could have my students look at and read. And so that's why we wanted some hope out there, right? Oh, and I see a question in there too on the bubble graphic. Let me see if I can find a link to that really quick. I should have had that up. But it's just called the Climate Venn diagram from Ayanna Johnson. I think it's climatevenn.org, but let me look that up and make sure that I'm not just making that up. And then I'll put the link in. That is not correct. Climate Venn diagram. It's super helpful because it really I've done this in a variety of different workshops and things like that, and it really allows people to kind of picture where they fit either at a group level or individually. I've worked with students, with researchers who are a little thank you. Yeah. So we both have it up there. It's on Ayanna Johnson's website. She just came out with an excellent book too called What If We Get It Right, which is another kind of hopeful take. One of the big strategies of big oil and other fossil fuel interests has been to kind of pivot from climate denialism, right? They really funded and put a lot of their weight behind denying that climate crisis was happening or that it was driven by human activity for like 30 years. A big source behind like political stalling in places like the US. But now that it's become harder and harder to do that, they're shifting to climate doomism, right? The idea that it's too late. Yes, this is happening. It's human driven. Fossil fuels are driving it, but we can't really do anything about it. So we might as well just like throw up our hands and give up in terms of all of the work that we're all doing. And nothing gets under my skin more because it's not too late. And that's just like patently false, right? So I think we really have a lot to do, of course, but all of us are involved in this work that Ayanna Johnson and others are really trying to highlight, right? In terms of all of the important efforts that are already underway and that could be built to build these different systems.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Probably have time for maybe one more question if anyone has one. Susan?
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. And I got so much out of it. There's only 2 minutes left, but can you comment on kind of ways to bring together the climate and health silos often divided? Data doesn't match sometimes. It's hard to have the two silos talk to each other. Can you speak to how some strategies for starting to do that in a better way?
Yeah, I think that organizationally, we can look at like organizations like Physicians for Social Responsibility and things like that that are kind of bridging the medical profession and the idea of health with the impacts of things like air pollution and climate is often linked. Climate crisis, of course, is often linked to other environmental issues like air pollution. But really, it's a paradigmatic shift that we can all facilitate in terms of shifting from a biomedical model, right, where everything is driven by individual level. We characterize health as being driven only by individual level behaviors and dynamics like diet, lifestyle, genetics, which are really important, but tend to not recognize the environmental and social drivers of health as well. And so there's a lot of work being done by folks like Phil Brown, I worked with at Brown University when I did my postdoc there, but many other folks, right, who are working on kind of moving us to that environmental health paradigm where we recognize that the air pollution we might face, the increased or intensified natural disasters that folks might face, and their relationship to pollution that results, right? Like when refineries or pipelines are implicated in big hurricanes and other natural disasters, linking those a bit more, right? And encouraging this this kind of discussion around how the environment in which we're embedded deeply impacts our health and well-being, right? And that's already happening in some spaces, even in the US, but there tends to be this really stubborn focus on mainstream epidemiology, not environmental, but mainstream tends to really focus on those individual level drivers of health. But we have so much evidence in epidemiology and sociology and elsewhere, right, about those important links. And particularly in terms of advocating for policy changes around children's health. I think that's one of the most compelling spaces to focus on and to get people to engage a little bit more. It's often folks in caretaking roles, right? Not just parents, but folks who are in professions like teachers or school nurses, medical professions as well, that notice those changes but feel vulnerable professionally in terms of bringing those out. So trying to change the conversation and culture around that. I hope that helps, Susan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's all the time we have today. So thank you all for being here. And thank you again, Stephanie, for presenting today. That was a wonderful presentation. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both.